everyone, welcome. It's so nice to see you all here. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement at the Whitney. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight, whether you're here in the room with us, which is really wonderful to see, or tuning in virtually. Tonight's program, Around the Rose, Artists Reflect on Jay DeFeo, takes inspiration from DeFeo's best-known work, which is also one of the most iconic pieces in the Whitney's collection. That the rose is not more central to narratives of post-war American art history is both a testament to its utter singularity, but also a telling symptom of the endemic blind spots and biases of the discipline. However, tonight is not about the rose exactly. It was our starting point and perhaps a through line for the four remarkable artists who we have invited to consider DeFeo's work from their own unique perspectives. Our aim was to open up thinking about both Jay DeFeo and the rose, which may be her most well-known work, but is hardly the extent of her achievement as an artist. Before I turn things over to our speakers, I wanted to briefly sketch the story of the rose and how it came to be in the Whitney's collection. It starts, of course, with its making over 8 years from 1958 to 1966, during which time DeFeo worked and reworked its surface and added layers and layers of paint to achieve what she called, quote, a marriage between painting and sculpture. The story also includes its dramatic removal from DeFeo's apartment, immortalized by her friend Bruce Conner in his short film, The White Rose. It continues with DeFeo's struggle to exhibit and then store it, ultimately finding it a home at the San Francisco... Oh, sorry about that, everyone.
So it continues with DeFeo's struggle to exhibit and then store it, ultimately finding it a home at the San Francisco Art Institute, where it was entombed behind a wall in a conference room, and where it was still when DeFeo passed away in 1989. But in 1994, the rose reemerged in a dramatic rescue initiated by Lisa Phillips, then a curator at the Whitney. And after a painstaking restoration, it entered the Whitney's collection in 1995 and has become one of the most beloved and significant artworks that we have. Tonight's program has also been several years in the making, not quite as long as that story, but it is perhaps fitting given the long gestation of the rose as well as its slow and winding trajectory from DeFeo's apartment on Fillmore Street to the Whitney. It evolved through many wonderful conversations with Leah Levy, the director of the Jay DeFeo Foundation, and we are tremendously grateful to Leah and the staff and board of the DeFeo Foundation for making tonight's program possible on many levels. My colleague Jane Panetta, Nancy and Fred Pose's curator and director of the Whitney's collection, was also deeply involved in developing this program and will be joining the speakers for a conversation following their presentations. Finally, thank you to our speakers, who have delved into DeFeo's work and generously shared their insights throughout the process. We encourage them to approach DeFeo and the rose in their own way so as to create a constellation of voices and perspectives that will come together in a conversation at the end. Each artist will speak for about 10 minutes, and I'm going to briefly introduce them all now in the order that they will be speaking. And one last note, following the program, for those of you who are here with us in person, you are invited to view the rose, which is currently on view on in our 7th floor galleries. And if you're joining us virtually, we hope you'll be inspired to visit the rose and the Whitney very soon. So our first speaker tonight is Justine Kurland, and Justine is an artist who works with photography, and she's known especially for her utopian photographs of American landscapes and the fringe communities, both real and imagined, that inhabit them. She has taught at Parsons School of Design, Sarah Lawrence College, Columbia, and the International Center of Photography, and she currently offers online workshops to students regardless of their institutional affiliation. Our second speaker tonight will be Tishan Hsu, who since the mid-1980s has been probing the cognitive as well as physical effects of transformative technological advances on our lives. Through the use of unusual materials, software tools, and innovative fabrication techniques, his enigmatic paintings and sculptures explore and manifest poetic new ways to engage and reimagine the human body. Hsu's survey exhibition Liquid Circuit was on view at the Sculpture Center in New York in 2021 following its debut at the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles. And Tishan is joining us virtually tonight, and you can see him on the screen. Erin Jane Nelson is an artist and writer who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. In addition to her own practice, Erin also works in support of other artists, particularly in the South, and in service of a decentralized, mutualistic art world. From 2018 to 2021, she was the artistic director of Burnaway, a magazine of contemporary art and criticism from the US South. And her work was recently on view here at the Whitney in the exhibition Making Knowing, Craft and Art 1950 to 2019. And finally, our final speaker will be Park McArthur, who's also joining us virtually tonight. Park works with a variety of materials and processes, often questioning frameworks of dependency through the artistic form of the ready-made. Born in North Carolina, McArthur currently lives in New York, and her work was included here at the Whitney in the 2017 edition of the Whitney Biennial. So without further ado, Justine.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming out. I'm going to take this off, if you don't mind, so I can see out of my glasses. Yeah, thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Leah Levy, for being such an amazing art angel, and to Megan and Jane and all of the speakers I'm with. I feel very honored and humbled to be here. I'm gonna be showing a lot of photographs that I don't explain until halfway through the piece, so I just want you to know that these are images that Jay DeFeo took from 1970 through 1980 of her studio in Larkspur, California. Reading Jack Kerouac's On the Road inflamed my teenage desire to search for kicks, and because I'd seen Robert Frank's The Americans, I decided to bring a camera. For most of my adult life, I lived out of a car, experiencing untold pleasures in pursuit of my so-called freedom, in and out of step with the men who came before me. It would be too reductive to dismiss the Beats as the last artistic movement before the civil rights and women's liberation, one that championed a man who shot his wife and got away with it. But it does say something about what Jay DeFeo was up against in the 50s when she arrived in San Francisco's beat scene, an underground, more deeply submerged for being queerer, poorer, dirtier than the East Coast counterpart. Those on the West Coast were a group of poets and visual artists who leaned on and learned from Eastern mysticism, Kabbalah, and tarot. They riffed on each other's work, which they made and distributed for one another. As Wallace Berman described their circle, they were swinging in the shadows. Perhaps the lower stakes afforded Jay more opportunity, yet most other women in the scene have remained the shadows of the shadows, as the footnoted wives and lovers of a boy gang. My parents met at the Art Students League in New York City in the 60s. They both studied painting and worked with ambition. But after their marriage, my mother gave up painting to support them both with the income she earned from odd jobs. My father painted undisturbed in his studio and eventually convinced her to move far enough upstate that they could hunt and grow their food. Isolated, my mother raised the three of us with little help. She divorced him when I was still young. The Back to the Land movement was never kind to women, but my mother must have found some joy there because she still lives in the woods. She was born a decade after Jay, almost to the day, which makes them both Aries, the sign of a fighter. I learned about Jay DeFeo and her legendary rose in midlife at a time when the foundation for my own art making had begun to crumble. It had something to do with the death of my father, a protracted custody battle, and the lame duck of Obama's final term. Certain truths I believed weren't holding together. I just realized I'm on the wrong slide. Oh, sorry. Certain truths I believed weren't holding together. I developed a belated consciousness, aware now that my mode of photographing, heading out in the open road, and bringing the news back home was intrinsically bound to a westward land grab. Jay offered a different approach. The white rose is a fact painted somewhere on a slow curve between destinations, wrote Jay in a letter to Wallace Berman in 1965. At this point, Her mammoth painting was couch surfing in Pasadena before it landed in a conference room in the San Francisco Art Institute, entombed in plaster, and left behind a false wall for 20 years. It would only arrive in the Whitney 7 years after Jay's death, following its dramatic restoration. A slow curve might describe the journey of the rose, but it also speaks of the voluminous generosity of Jay's working method, one that embraced circularity rather than linear progression. The rose isn't exactly a painting and might be more architectural than sculptural, something to crawl through like a doorway or a cockle shell. I measure it with my body. The beveled rays are double my height and converge at eye level. They stretch the width of my wingspan were I an 8-foot woman. Its crusted surface, the gray pink of a sun-bleached earthworm, bulges voluptuously at the bottom and cracks under its own weight. A kaleidoscopic sphincter, more like a vagina that's been turned inside out than a flower, although it does petal around the edges. I hear the words to Ramona, your crack country lips I still wish to kiss as to be under the strength of your skin. I can see my mother dancing the chicken naked in the kitchen, flapping her elbows and twisting on one foot and then the other. The arm of the record player lifts mechanically and swings to reset, the needle dragging an ever-widening ball of dust. Maybe we're all naked, laughing hysterically or punching, spitting, and pulling hair, our movements swirling circles in the cigarette smoke trapped in the house. Jay lived inside the rose and among its accretions for 8 years of sustained concentration until her eviction in 1965. When Bruce Conner filmed the removal of the white rose, he accentuated its resemblance to a birthing, the hands of the movers like those of so many midwives. Someone had given the window an episiotomy to make way for the painting's girth. In the final shot, Jay dangles her feet out of the incision as though seeing the outside for the first time. Photographs show her Fillmore Street studio had a womb-like quality made loamy from the buildup of drips. Before vacating the studio, Jay hacked her painting estacada from where it had been embedded in the wall. The torn chunks of paint were stashed under her bed for 10 years, where they sopped up her dreams and gathered dust bunnies, until 1975, when she decided to throw them away. But then, reconsidering, Jay crept out of bed in the middle of the night to pick them out of the trash. I imagine her barefoot in the driveway, full of ambivalence, illicitly pawing through a garbage can. Jay liked to chew the ends of her paintbrushes while she mulled over her paintings. Perhaps the chemicals in the paint were the reason for her gum disease. The roots gave out at the exact same point that the rose was removed from the studio, as though the painting had dissolved into a handful of teeth. She photographed the teeth inside of a clamshell, a vagina dentata, and collaged them on top of a detail of the rose. In her 1973 collage, Traveling Portrait, Chance Landscape, a massing of teeth layer and slither around each other as if wading through a puddle of saliva. In the psychoanalytic tradition, the loss of teeth is associated with castration, the loss of one's ability to create. And yet Jay's post-Rose work transcends impotence. Carl Jung once wrote, "To be fruitful provokes one's downfall," meaning all life revolves in a cyclical pattern of creation and obliteration. Psychoanalyst Sabina Spielrein and Jung's former partner expanded on this with her notion of the death drive, later co-opted by Freud in her essay, Destruction as the Cause of Coming into Being. She believed that in our erotic desire for connection and creation, we bring ourselves closer to complete sublimation of self, in essence, to our own death. What is a death rose if not a reminder of beauty fastened to its impermanence, which is also to say, without death, life has no meaning. For Sabina, the death drive propelled us back to the moment of our birth and reconnected us to the Great Mother. The more I worry about my mother dying, the less frequently I visit her. I began photographing her during those trips, once in the matter of Courbet's gynecological painting, La Origine du Monde. I took my son to see that painting when he was 4. He pointed, exclaiming, "Look, Mama, it's your vagina." But then, finding fault with the painting's accuracy, he added, "But your vagina is messier." He had no fear of the real, whereas my mother complained I had made her vagina look like a death hole. For the flowers of the city, though breath-like, get death-like sometimes. I love the weight of Jane's small photographs, humble objects such as a crab shell or a shoe shot at close range. Torn or cut fragments of photographs migrate into collages or become studies for paintings. The paintings, in turn, are photographed either alone or assembled with other images. These promiscuous acts of translation and reconfiguration engender new pieces and gather rotational gravity from their orbit. Jay photographed a visual diary of her Lake Spur studio, these are the contact sheets that you're seeing. And made hundreds of contact sheets she kept in binders. They read as short films on process, marking time and dematerializing the work. The frames compress her studio assemblages and her works in progress into 2¼ inch square miniatures, automatic collages, indexing her lexicon. Although the photographs came after the rose, I would argue they are her primary media, inasmuch as photographs make relics out of the everyday. Jay often posed in front of the rose or photographed it herself. It first existed publicly as a process photograph published in MoMA's exhibition catalog for their 1959 show 16 Americans, even though the painting wasn't in the show. It appeared in 1961 for Art in America and again the following year for Look magazine. Documentation reveals its various incarnations, from the sharp geometry of the death rose to the frosted gills of the white rose to its final state, an equilibrium between the organic and the crystalline, as the rose. One critic described the painting as fossilized light, which makes its photograph a fossil of a fossil. My mother didn't take many pictures of us when I was growing up, although now her refrigerator is plastered with pictures of her dead lover, and small shrines of his image scatter through her home. Back then, she collected other keepsakes, snake skins or some feathers from a walk. I would sneak into her bedroom when I was little to handle a smooth black stone she kept on her dresser, surprisingly heavy and always cold. When I left home, I asked if I could have it. She told me she had stolen it from a childhood friend and that she wouldn't give it to me, but if I needed it, I could steal it from her. In 1953, Jay was caught stealing the paint she needed for her canvases. The police made sure she lost her job and her teaching credentials, so she sold small sculptures as jewelry instead. One of those pieces, a copper pendant with 3 concentric discs, initiated her first experimentation with a circular form and a center point, a precursor to the rose. In a nude photograph by Wallace Berman, Jay holds the disc in front of her vagina, and in many other photographs, it hangs around her neck. By producing a double of the world, a camera so closely imitates the function of a mirror that the first photographs were called mirrors of nature. But in Jay's photograph, the mirror looks back at itself, an infinite reflection. She drew a 7-foot-long picture of her disembodied eye and regarded it as a kind of prophecy, a vision machine, that allowed her to conceive the future rose. On the back, she transcribed a poem by Philip La Mancha. Tell him I have eyes only for heaven as I look to you, Queen Mirror of the heavenly court. To have eyes only for heaven is to bring her work into an explicitly spiritual realm, further emphasized by the phrase, as I look to you, Queen Mirror. In this regard, the rose figures as Queen Mirror of heaven, a divine reflection, her eyes open with a kind of ecstatic religious vision. The first painting Jay made after the rose, titled After Image, might be interpreted as a closed eye, the feathery labia folding shut like myriad eyelids. Several years ago, I began cutting up books in my library by canonized male photographers and made collages from the pieces. It was a necessary act of destruction in order to free literal space in my bookshelves and psychic space in my brain. Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto inspired the cutting, but I felt surrounded by so many other mothers of my heart. Diana DePrima wrote a one-line poem in 1976 from her collection, Revolutionary Letters. Get your cut, throw it off my knife. I wanted her to say kitchen knife, as in Hannah Hawke's collage, Cut with the Kitchen Knife, and Marina Chow's essay, cunts with the kitchen knife. Coincidentally, Maurice Geordius, who published Diana de Prima's work, also published Valerie Solanas' Scum Manifesto. Valerie initially was looking to shoot Maurice, but since he was out of town, she shot Warhol instead. Lately, I've been cutting the flowers from the pages of William Eggleston's 7-volume set, The Democratic Forest. Freed from his compositions, they dangle from the webbed vines, delicate and lacy. I see myself vaginating the wealthy old drunk, who once compared his compositional style to a recreation of the Confederate flag. Now that my mother is in her 80s, she only keeps a flower garden. Zinnias because they grow so well and keep popping up all summer. Peonies because they are luscious and loud. Foxglove because they raise the garden's canopy. And bleeding hearts because they droop so elegantly. Cut flowers, especially tiger lilies, that grow along the road sit in the middle of her table all summer. Flowers are a symbol of a juicy life, she explains, but they're also that life. After a while, the flowers in the vase die. I used to throw them out, but it came to a point where I could see the dead flowers have their own beauty. Pat's dead, the flowers are dead, and that's all okay. Little is written about the lung cancer that ended Jay's life. Her last entry quotes Pat Roadgast, who channeled the spirit Emmanuel. Quote, "If we could launder the word cancer, hang it out in the sun to dry, and bring it back bleached white and beautiful, I promise you that there would be less cancer and less death from it. Souls would choose another way." My mother is a close reader of Jane Roberts, who channels the spirit Seth in her book, Seth Speaks. Seth tells us we create our own reality through our belief system, and whatever we believe will happen when we die is whatever we believe will happen after our death is what will happen. Excuse me. My mother has been busy preparing for her death by imagining a beautiful place to die into. I remember the book from my childhood. It was purple and sat on the shelf alongside Our Bodies, Ourselves, and the astrology book, Heaven Knows What. The black and white photographs that illustrated the text pictured a middle-aged woman sitting erect, cross-legged in tights and leotard. Her expression distorted grotesquely, frame after frame, as the spirit Seth passed through her. It might have been these pictures that made me want to be a photographer, but when I looked for them as an adult and I combed through every edition of the book, I just couldn't find them anywhere. Thank you.
Tishan, are you ready?
Yeah, okay, sorry. I thought
No problem.
so I was not very familiar with the rose until it was shown at the Whitney. Um, and I don't have an art historical perspective on DeFeo's work. So I'm just going to describe my sort of gut level reaction to both the rose, which is the only one that I've seen. I unfortunately missed the retrospective. And her other works that I've seen in reproduction. So my reaction to the rose is one, it's a very singular work. It's extremely physical. The physicality is sort of monumental. And then it is overlaid with this sort of mystical quality to it. And the two combined, for me, is what made it so unique and very mysterious. The fact that this artist was represented by one work and it seemed like this was the work was very puzzling to me. And only now that I have become much more familiar with the range of her practice do I have a much better understanding, at least from my perspective, of what she's doing here. So one thing about the rose was that it felt more like an event when I'm standing in front of it. And that there at first is this kind of graphic quality to it as you approach it. but then this sense of something is happening, partly because perhaps that she took so long to do it, and so the process itself becomes or emanates. Um, and I think that made it very unique, or makes it very unique to see. The second thing, of course, was the composition, which is so centered, um, that was very mysterious to me. It's sort of like it's like going through a moment and wondering what is behind it. Um, One of the things that changed my perception of this as was that I started looking at the rest of her practice, which was varied. And it was interesting that she went into both photography and her drawings, which were particularly compelling for me. And in seeing both those two media, I could see more of a sense of sort of an unconscious process, or perhaps the way Justine referred to it as circular, which for me reminded me a bit of Joseph Beuys's practice, where you can't really understand what she's doing by just looking at one work. It's not like each work is kind of emblematic of her entire practice. Can we go to the next slide? So this is some very early sculpture that she did, which I thought was interesting in that my reaction of the mysticism was sort of validated when I saw this very early sculpture. The one on the left for me was a cross, and then one on the right somehow for me elicited the sense of the KKK. And the two together are two symbols that are often put together. And that was very interesting. Can we have the next image? And so here we jump. These are later works after the rose in her drawings. This is just simply a pair of goggles, like swimming goggles. But the way she's done it for me was very mysterious and a strange sense of becoming. Perhaps partly because of the shading and the soft focus, and yet to something very specific and concrete as a goggle. It was sort of like emerging and emergent. And that is also an attribute that I felt with the rose, that I thought was really, really interesting and very compelling for me. I think for me that kind of resonated with this idea of an unconscious process that is perhaps more elusive and coming in and out of focus. And I thought these drawings were very much elicited that sense. Next image, please. So the teeth images were also very compelling. I mean, this brought in the body. I didn't quite have the biography that Justine just illuminated. But just looking at the teeth, one is just her rendering. I thought it was beautiful, the way she did it, and the strangeness with which the angle. I mean, it's very photographic in the sense you wouldn't put them necessarily, if you're able to retrieve your teeth, let's say from the dentist, and put them on a table. So there's a certain level of imagination going on here, just in the way she's located it on the page, and that in the rose, it's a very sculptural, architectural kind of physicality. But here, it's much more literal in the sense of the reference to the teeth. And then so kind of, it's not really microscopic, but so detailed, a very detailed part of the body. At the same time, it's a very sculptural part of the body. And I thought that was really, the contrast of these different references to the body was very unusual and kind of original at that time. I think one of the things that struck me in learning more about her work was just the context in which she was working, the time and the location of California versus New York. And that it's so singular and original in the sense of that I, in the sense that I couldn't really place her work in a particular narrative that, or sort of the conventional narrative of 20th century American work. And that's where it recalls for me Boyce's work, which, if you're familiar with the full range, it has that same kind of ambiguous reference. Okay, the next image, please. This is a more abstract one, but in context of the last image, again, is this a more abstract sense of growth, or even explicitly of teeth. Could we go to the next image? And then here, for me, it's that she then moves to, her photographic work, where she goes into another medium. So for me, looking at the different works that we've seen so far, I try to get a sense of what's the sense that comes out by just experiencing all of them together. And that's where the sense of the unconscious, of sort of something very mysterious and not so easily articulated, comes out. And for me, that is part of the originality that I experience in her work. It opens itself to many, many kinds of interpretations in different contexts. And now that we have, the perspective of time, I can see one can see intimations of different works that came after different periods, that for me comes out of originality. The rose here, this is literally a flower, and we could we can see perhaps a reference of the rose. That's less interesting for me. It's more her use of photography, and that she was beginning to, that she went from this very massive architectural piece of the rose, which I would almost imagine she would go into sculpture, but instead she drops that whole thing. She drops materiality, and she moves into photography, or first drawings, and even the technology of the photograph, and that for me was interesting. So she has these two extremes. The next image, please. I very much like these works, where, again, in a very different medium, a different kind of format, it has still the qualities from the drawings of this something is happening. I think of Francis Bacon's work, where the body is abstracted and you feel some kind of transformation, but a sort of twisting anguish in a way. But in the way that I've described the earlier work, for me, it sort of heightens, intensifies the sense that I'm getting from her work in all these different modalities. So that, for me, gives me a stronger sense of what the work is about, in contrast to just seeing the rose, and perhaps then qualifies how I see the rose. Next image, please. Another artist I just somehow my mind went to was Hilma af Klint, and particularly these paintings, where you have this kind of mystical symbolism that perhaps came out of, I'm not familiar with what was going on in San Francisco and the Beat Generation, but given the time, this was the emergence of abstract expressionism, or even, very early, perhaps pop art even. This kind of mystical symbolism I see very much in the rose, and then it's just interesting, this work coming much, much earlier in Klint's work. The difference, though, for me, heightens the impact, or what I see in the rose, which is this is much more graphic, the imagery, where the rose is so physical and the sense of process and emergence is so powerful, separate from the symbolic imagery. And that layered, very rich references of the rose, for me, makes it singular. Next image, please. I thought it was interesting. I mean, this isn't her work. Someone took the photograph, but that she, connected the rose or the imagery, the format of the rose, to literally her body. I thought added a lot to my understanding of the rose, perhaps, but also to some of the other works that I've talked about, so that my intuition of her reference to the body was validated when I see that she literally here is sort of overlaying her literal body with the rose, the physicality. It's also interesting, again, where this is kind of a performance on a very physical, structural material object. There's that kind of combination of different media and disciplines. And you have to think of the time that she was doing this. This is very early, when it was, still very much about painting or sculpture or printmaking. So this kind of multidisciplinary integration was very unusual. I think of Naumann, really, quite a bit later. Okay, I think that's it. Is there one more image? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tishan.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Am I hearable? Okay. Special thanks to Leah from the Jay DeFeo Foundation for all of her help as I asked a bunch of questions trying to figure out my thoughts on this work. I've written a short text that I will read from, and all of the images, they're all from the Archives of American Art, and they come from DeFeo's ephemera from her studio. I thought incorrectly that reading everything I could find about DeFeo in the Rose would light a clear path into the work and into the artist's motives. I've driven myself to near frustration, asking the ghost of DeFeo why she started the work in the first place, why she kept going for 8 years, why she was unable to work on almost anything else, why it had to be made out of paint at all, why she said no to the many institutions interested in showing and acquiring the work during the production time, why the work ruined her marriage, as she said, why she was unable to rush, and why she waited until getting kicked out of her studio to contend with its inevitable ending. In spite of all the lore and writing around the Rose, DeFeo herself has said very little about any of these whys. When asked directly what prompted the conception of the piece, she replied, quote, "As I have said before, I'm left with a complete blank when someone asks me about the philosophical and metaphysical things that it implies. I'll let the Rose speak for itself." When I look at the Rose and ask for it to speak for itself, it responds, "I am a clock. I am about and made of time." "But Rose," I respond, "how the hell do you talk about time without sounding trite? What is there left to say about time?" "Nothing," it responds. But I can't talk about a work like The Rose without throwing the clumsiness of language against ideas as universal and grand as time and the cosmos. I see The Rose as a clock marking the kind of time that is especially familiar to women. The kind of time where you worry about time and spend your time trying to make peace with the fact of time, having enough of it, aging, running out the clock, biological clocks, making the most of your youth, attending to the clocks of all the people you implicitly become full-time care workers for, like spouses and children and parents. The Rose is a clock that betrays linear patriarchal time, a perspective of time where one progresses along a vector in career, in family, in studio work, and steadily moves upward from point A to point B. Instead, the rose as a clock is about cosmic, elliptical, orbital time, the kind of clock that reminds us that all of our ideas of time come from trying to tame the stars, from trying to tame each other and own each other's time. DeFeo called the work several things before deciding on simply the rose. One of the more poignant of these alternate titles was Death Rose. When asked why she dropped the word death from the title of the piece, DeFeo explained that she didn't want the work to be grimly associated with the negative cultural connotations of death, but that she wanted it to embrace both life and death at the same time. She reasoned that the idea of the rose on its own was better at balancing those forces. And after 8 years of making the work, having lost her studio, having lost art world interest in her work, having lost her family, all that was left for DeFeo to care for was a hillside garden in Marin, where she spent several years recuperating. While the bodily references of the rose's form have foregrounded a lot of the readings of the work, I love the idea of the flower as a stand-in for the cyclic, ungraspable, beautiful, and brief fact of time. It's a construct that I use a lot in my own work. For example, I colloquially referred to this piece as the rose while working on it in my studio for the better part of a year. Not thinking of or trying to reference DeFeo's masterpiece, my use of rose as a nickname came from the spiraling ceramic linkages that are meant to both twist outward from the center and curl in on itself protectively, and from the fact that the work has photographs of frozen flowers from my own garden on a hillside in Georgia. While not an homage to DeFeo's rose, I'm pleased that we both found pathways to abstract such a stereotypically femme and romantic symbol to our own ends. And like DeFeo, this is a work I have tried and failed to neatly and coherently explain since I finished and exhibited it last fall. In his recent book about Jay DeFeo and other Bay Area artists, curator Jordan Stein writes, quote, "We often turn to art for coherence, forsaking its ability to clearly reflect the opposite," end quote. This quote and the rose make me feel foolish as an artist for all of my fussing about coherence. I work recklessly, making constantly, exuberantly, responding to and referencing everything that washes over me in real time, and then parsing it in language for others. It's clear that DeFeo knew that the scariest and most powerful acts available to artists are actually going slow, ignoring coherence, and saying no. The result of which is the bright, acerbic space of sitting alone in your head in the studio as time ticks along faster and faster as the years go by, finding yourself less and less able to hide from yourself and the work that comes out of you. The painter, feminist theorist, and psychoanalyst Bracha Ettinger wrote recently about her own work in a way that reminded me of Jay DeFeo's commitment to painting the rose and the obsessive, almost spiritual connection the work required. Quote, "To paint is to self-fragilize myself, to make myself vulnerable in accessing the other in the cosmos, to join as I differ, to witness what I give witness to. In my process, the abstract universe encounters the one that we live in, a world absorbed by pain and violence, and offers itself up to it in a kind of trust after the end of trust." Throughout the story of DeFeo and her rose, her unceasing trust and belief in the work, in herself, in time, in possibility, has maybe been the most astounding fact to me. I'd like to end tonight by sharing a poem that I found in DeFeo's archives among a small collection of ephemera. I have to assume that these scraps of poems were on her studio wall while she worked on the rose. This scrap is attributed to John Chance and was published by DeFeo's friend Wallace Berman in his art and poetry journal Semina. And when I encountered it, it seemed to answer some of my whys about the rose and the space of infinite possibility DeFeo pledged herself to for nearly a decade. Every idea we took up was carried to a point where it disappeared, into the infinity of possibility. So there we sat. There was something humorous about charging out to the edge of the infinite, only to find ourselves in that moment, looking blankly across the table at one another, locked in the same room. Thank you.
Hi, this is Park McArthur. Am I coming through okay?
Yes, you're great.
Cool. Thank you. Along with my fellow panelists, I'm also an artist, and I'm really delighted to be here. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'll just briefly echo the sentiments of appreciation for everyone at the Whitney, Megan, Andy, Jane, Leah Levy, Don Troy, Carly Sicko, the Jay DeFeo Foundation, all of the access workers. It's been a wonderful occasion that I'm just very grateful for. So to briefly visually describe myself, I'm a white person with long brown hair wearing a dark green sweater, gold chain. I use a mouthpiece ventilator to occasionally take sips of breath. Behind me are 3 windows with the blinds down. On the screen is a small 4-inch by 5.5-inch artwork by DeFeo, dated 1973, described as a photo collage. The work is untitled. And we get a sense that there are 2 smaller photos in sepia tones of brown and white, and they've been placed side by side. This reflection makes one image out of 2 identical ones. And in our ambiguous viewing perspective, it's as if we're flying high with a bird's eye view above a giant waterfall, clouds blooming over rushing water. Or perhaps we're zooming in like a microscope into mold spores or yeast tendrils. The collage doesn't feature DeFeo's characteristic torn white edge of ripped paper that often imparts its own narrative contours. Instead, it's brought together by a vertical line like a mirror's edge. Thinking about Untitled in relation to The Rose and DeFeo's practice more widely, we encounter an artist who is no longer living and whose work we may or may not have experienced in person, but who across all of these realities is still very much with us. And this with us is something I really was thinking about and feel grateful for. As a student of art living in this particular time and place and set of cultural norms, some questions about it came up, such as, how are we able to experience these artworks? How does our experience of an artwork relate to an artist or DeFeo's feelings about the permanence or impermanence of the art? How do these things, whether they're on our screens or in a room, or we might be touching them or hearing them described, how do they travel distances to us and us to them? And who is carrying them? How might we think about preservation, if not as forms of keeping and sharing at the same time? And if a museum such as the Whitney did in 1995, in order to exhibit the Rose, remove the artwork from behind the conference room wall, ship it west to east across the country, restore it, stabilize it structurally, and then acquire it for their collection, what else can we ask museums to do? How can museums not only move literal mountains, but also perhaps more importantly, care for them? The DeFeo Foundation director, Leah Levy, who has been mentioned tonight, has noted that the foundation itself is a continually reflexive learning process, and over the decades that it has existed, has changed its legal status several times and its name 3 times. Levy helped me understand through this quote a little bit more about the foundation. Quote, the sentences in DeFeo's will setting up the trust, the trustees applied for foundation status later, are limited and straightforward. She bequeathed her works of art and her archive to a trust to be administered by 2 trustees. The purpose of the trust was to preserve her artworks and further their public exposure and encourage the arts in general. No funds were given to support these endeavors, but works could be sold to support the work of the trust. End quote. In addition to endowing the trust, the sale of artworks was also used to resolve bills and payments, and some existing funds were used to set up a monetary award going to a graduating MFA student each year at Mills College in California, where DeFeo taught for many years. And later, at some point, as Erin just mentioned, the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. acquired DeFeo's personal papers. If we can go to the next slide, please. These are the additional details of the artwork that was mentioned earlier. And then we can go to one more slide, please. Today, the DeFeo, I might be mistaken. Today, the DeFeo Foundation is part of an emerging and growing group of artist foundations that is both inventing new forms of stewardship as it itself is also being studied. The web link on the screen is one that Levy pointed me to. It is an Aspen Institute sponsored study published in 2013 that surveyed hundreds of artist endowed foundations. Although it seems many foundations would prefer to remain background to the bodies of artwork they are charged for caring for, maybe it's interesting to think about how, like before there were curatorial master's degrees, there were people organizing exhibitions, performances, and making things happen. So maybe by 2025, there will be a graduate degree in artist foundations, but there is always the day-to-day activity of people welcoming other people into rooms filled with boxes and flat files in a shared desire to make sense of what hundreds of pounds of oil paint carefully layered onto a giant board might mean. And those are my very brief remarks. Thank you. And I'll turn it over to Jane for the rest of the evenings.
Okay. Take my mask off. Thank you guys all so much. And before we dig in with the questions, I just want to kind of acknowledge and say thank you for all coming at it in such kind of different and interesting ways. And as much as your presentations were maybe not talking at length about your own work, I just want to sort of say to the audience that I think a lot of the ways into the work for each of you relates to the work you make yourself. So I think that's a really lovely subtext there for future watchers of this panel to dig in with further. So one thing I wanted to start with, and you guys all touched on this, but I wanted to sort of dig in with this a little more because it goes right to the question of us having this panel kind of around the rose, let's say, and not about the rose, is I want to go back to this very famous quote that Billy Al Bankston said about DeFeo's work. He said, "Never look at just one of Jay's paintings." And you guys all got at that, obviously. And for me, the quote felt like a kind of intentional awareness. He makes this quote at like 69, I want to say, Leah can correct me later, that there was already a sense of this kind of over-focus maybe on this painting. And maybe something we're participating in today, one could argue. So I was interested in talking to all of you and hearing from you as makers about this phenomenon of kind of a single artwork maybe going on to dominate a discussion of an artist's work, or like a particular decade of their work, or a series of work they make, a show they do. And for us, how do we think about, and you guys got at this, I think, how do we continue to think about how we establish the right conversation around DeFeo that feels adequately expansive? You guys were all very careful to talk about the work through the breadth, I would say, of her work and life, so I definitely want to note that. And I wonder where DeFeo might have felt about this discussion, and this kind of focus on this work. What were her desires around the question of balancing the importance of the rose, which she surely understood, the amount of time she worked on it, how she talked about it later, but how to balance that with the kind of broad range of her work. So I'm curious to hear from you guys on that. And Park and Tishan, maybe I'll turn to you guys first if you have thoughts there.
Well, my initial reaction or thought is that art is so vast and varied, and the creation of art by artists, that I don't think there's any way that one should talk about an artist's oeuvre as an observer versus the artists themselves. If right now we're talking about the rose, perhaps because that's the piece that's in the Whitney, who knows how other people in another time might see her work. I mean, if someone showed me all the drawings in a gallery, I might really start talking about the drawings. But given that, it seems that an artist's work elicits its own discussion or its own discourse. I can think of other artists in history where their works are dominated by a few works. I think, so I don't have a problem with that. I do think, from my experience of DeFeo's work, that her works are not as known as other artists in the sense of the full range of what she's done. And maybe just because of the presence of the rose in her oeuvre is very, very powerful, that her oeuvre kind of focuses the attention on the rose. So I feel like it sort of emerges out of her practice in some sense. Yeah.
I think that this is Park speaking. And I'm just gonna try to ride Tishan's coattails and just say, I similarly feel like it's a contextual question. There are works that get maybe more resources or support, or there are ones that have more visibility. But I think it's also that time question of, I guess there are works of Justine's and Tishan's and Erin's that I might know more than others, but if I were to be able to sit with their practices longer, other things emerge and come out. So there's both the contextual thing and how things are contextualized, which is the kind of exciting ongoing work that researchers and scholars do with artist practices. But then there's also like me as the audience member, that I get to spend more time with an artist's work, and is kind of the joy of being able to do it over one's lifetime. Mm-hmm. So that's a little bit dodging your question, but I think.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I'll just mute now.
Okay.
I agree with both of you guys, but just to throw the other foot in, one of the articles that I came across that actually Jordan Stein talks about in Riptails is an article that came out in, I think it was whatever the New York Times of California is, that featured Jay DeFeo as in this 4-year hiatus where in fact she was making a ton of other work, this very misogynistic, like, article that was like the one-hit wonder, you know, lady in search of an encore, I think was the title, and that like she has to garden because she can't think what to do next. So it's like, I think that there is some, I don't think it's her problem. I think it's a maybe the way that, like, even if you think of like rock stars or something, that there's like the one song that everyone will sing, and it's like a, yeah. So I think it's a really important thing to kind of think about how to balance it. And then the other thing, oh my God, I talked too much. I'm sorry. The other thing that I was thinking about is my father, who's a painter, as you guys all know, and I guess I always go back to the family. Said that when you're a young man, you're in your heroic period, and that during that time, you build the parameters for a practice, and that you spend the rest of your life refining and recombing inside of the barriers of the parameters of whatever you had made in the heroic time. So in a way, I think that the rose, she's so lucky that that was such an infinite parameter she made for herself, because I feel like the work that she makes after it just like dives in and generates all of this stuff from that spot. So they're like, you know, interlinked in some ways yeah.
Yeah, and I like that its presence, or like its hyper presence, is generative in that case, not reductive. Erin, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, two things kind of come to mind in that respect. The first being that I think the rose is a really interesting anomaly, because I think when you think of those sort of quintessential artworks of an artist, or like the masterpieces, so to speak, it's often comes with a degree of like notoriety. I think many of the examples I can think of are tied to controversies, or tied to, you know, things that like almost paint the artist in a bad light, or overcloud what is otherwise like a very, you know, multivalent process or whatever. And then the second thing that comes to mind, and I don't think that this is for all artists, but I do think that this is like for me, and I think for a lot of artists, the work that comes out of the studio and goes into spaces and that people see, I mean, that's part of it, but I think that the reason why most artists make art is like the actual process of making and discovery and thinking, and like the actual artworks are almost incidental. And so I think that, yeah, it just, the rose became sort of like the microcosm of that because of how much of that it was. But yeah, I think a lot of artists would probably be, I don't think artists are that worried about like what people are looking at. I think it's more just like what they're thinking through.
Yeah, and she, you know, I've also was always interested in the fact that on the one hand, she was very aware of its importance for her. She says, always the rose is present in my imagination as a kind of central core of my life's work. So she owns that, but then also talked a lot about the desire to have, to see work in kind of contrasting ways from work to work, between work. So I like that there is that phenomenon of the rose, but of course, as a generative thing and even beyond it. So Justine talked about this a bit, but I'd love to kind of dig in with photography, building on this idea of moving down the rose a little bit, dig in with photography a bit, which was obviously so key to her. You know, she was taking photographs, she was collaging photographs, you know, making photo-based work. But I'm also interested in this issue of, and especially in, let's say in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? If we think about kind of what the technology was at the time, as Erin pointed out, this question of photography as documentation for her. And even going back to this interesting idea to me that she wasn't ready to let the death rose go to the Museum of Modern Art for 16 Americans, but she let a photograph of the work in progress go there. Mm-hmm. So I wanted that, and that's really fascinating to me. And we know the rose has these different lives. Justine showed a lot of these images, and she was kind of comfortable with putting that out there in the world to an extent. So I wanted to hear from you guys a little bit. Of course, you guys are probably taking pictures all the time in a very different way, but for her, what that would have been about, that kind of, why would this have been important to her? And, you know, was this about, something strikes me that it's about sort of demystifying the work on the one hand, or is it really about this idea of practice and process? So curious to hear from you guys about that a bit. And Park and Tishan, I'll turn to you guys first.
Well, the thought I have here was, I mean, this is an old sort of academic debate. I mean, are we talking about what the work is doing when we see it as a viewer, or what the artist intends? And what do we want to privilege here in that sense? If we're talking about what it's doing, so I guess, so my comments premise that the idea that art in some ways is an unconscious process. And that could be argued, certainly. But to the extent that it is, what the artist does may not be what the context, the culture, wherever it is, does with it. And so for me, if we take specifically this use of photography and then sending the photograph of the work, to me that, I mean, she's very prescient in the sense of a process and a process art, particularly given the timing of when she's doing this, which to me is, you know, a very powerful thing for her to do creatively, separate from the work that she's photographing. Now, she may have not been so conscious of that at all, and I certainly don't know why she did it, but for me, that's what I take away from it. And I like the fact that she took the photograph and sent it. I think that's a very radical move. And at this point in time, you know, we could write a whole thesis just on that act of sending the photograph rather than the object. Anyway, that's my initial reaction.
This is Park speaking. Yeah, I would just echo that there's something both about mediation and kind of having a self-determined relationship to mediation if you are taking the photographs and sending them. And then the possible kind of immobility of the artwork, and whether that's both a kind of material immobility, like it's really meant to be in a particular place, or it's not ready to leave, or it's sort of this protective boundary that's like, this material can move and will, and it's for whatever reason, like possible to be kind of sent out into the world, and this one's not. So maybe there's a sort of like time question, but it also gives me, I mean, I'm not someone who's necessarily worked on one artwork for 8 years, although I feel like I'm just making the same thing over and over again in some ways. But I could imagine, like, being engaged in a really long process that you are and do want to share things alongside its incompleteness. And so I think of that being kind of, social in a way where you both are able to kind of invite people into the studio, but also send things out. And maybe, I mean, she began or continued as a painter. And so maybe there's a way also of taking pictures in the studio that allows you to sort of like, as the painter might move away from the object, like look at it in another form or kind of see it from another perspective. Maybe that was something, I'm purely speculating here, but like maybe there was something about giving DeFeo giving herself another way into the work that she might be otherwise very proximate to, or like, really bound up or kind of close to. And I guess just to know, not before reading Dana Miller's, like the retrospective, I didn't know that she made a darkroom in her studio. So there's also this kind of like material resource commitment to photography. You're like, oh, you're really like living with these chemicals. Like you're like here processing stuff. So those would be my thoughts.
Yeah. Before I turn to Erin and Justine Park, one thing I was thinking when you were talking is actually Dana in her essay in the Whitney monograph, she talks about photography as being, I don't want to misquote it here, a means to sharpening the perception of the work. And I think that like really resonated with me when I read it, and you were getting at that. Anyway, Justine and Erin, thoughts about photography?
Yeah, this is Erin speaking. I think it just didn't really occur to me as I was seeing all the sort of contact sheets of images of the work in process that, these are, medium format film photographs that she's developing in black and white, and wondering sort of, as an artist, I photograph things as I make them all the time, and oftentimes, rotating a thing or making it little or making it big, it sounds dumb, but it kind of helps you figure things out. And I can't imagine I make things that go on a wall, and so it has a level of like flatness to it. I can't imagine not having that tool. So in a way, I think she is quite ahead of her time. And then I think Park spoke to this a little bit, but I think it in a way it gets away from this sort of, maybe this is like patriarchal idea of genius, like aha, like the aha moment. Like I think it shows that, people and artworks and the relationships between the two are really complicated and ever evolving and sensitive to each other.
Yeah, totally. We know you love the photography.
I know. Well, that's why I'm going to say something different, actually. I think I'm taking in what everyone is saying, but I think it's important to know that the rose was painted over another painting. So, and the process pictures that I showed where we saw the death rose, the white rose, and the rose, all three of them together, I think when I think about what I'm calling a circularity, where one piece comes into another piece or generates the next piece, or the idea kind of finds other forms and this iterative practice, that there's all of these finished pieces along that process. Mm-hmm. So like when you're talking about a clock, like it does keep these kind of time, and I think photography is really adept at finding that. And the thing about the contact sheets that just blows my mind is the way that she's making relationships between the works of art that then unfold and a different relationship is made. So it's the way that it can transform from one thing into the next thing into the next thing that is so remarkable, and so part of like every part of her practice, where the rose itself starts as one painting that we don't know what it looks like, but then is all these paintings inside of that one rose that still contains, so it's fascinating.
That seems like a very beautiful note to end on, Justine, so thank you. I'm sorry that we're out of time, that we don't have time for questions, but Park, Tishan, Erin, Justine, I really want to thank you guys all so much for the time you spent thinking about the work, looking at the work, and everything you shared. And want to thank everyone for joining us here in person and who tuned in virtually. And also want to encourage everyone who's here, you can go up and see the rose in person now on the 7th floor. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.